I'm Kit Kennedy. Recently, I published a story titled How I Survived Gay Conversion Therapy. It was my husband's story. With a religious freedom bill under development in Australia federally, and with much needed moves to ban gay conversion therapy on a state level, I thought it would be a good time to talk about how religious freedoms and protections for LGBT people can exist side by side. There's been a bit of fear-mongering happening in the wake of the marriage equality plebiscite with regard to religious freedoms, in my opinion, and it will likely continue with the gay conversion therapy ban in conversations. I don't believe it's warranted. Why? Because there's a big difference between religious freedom and a religious free-for-all. The truth is that churches are already regulated. The Charities Commission covers our tax exemption status. We need permits to host events or build in certain zones. Ministers don't get to hide behind the pulpit when it comes to reporting abuse, hopefully even the confessional in future. And in truth, most ministers wouldn't even want to. There are other examples, but the point is that church is regulated and the sky hasn't fallen. But when it comes to what's said from our pulpits and how we help society's most vulnerable, people can get a little bit testy. I believe in religious freedom for everybody, not just Christians. What people say behind the pulpit should be protected, but there's a hard truth that exists alongside this. We've just watched victim after victim of child abuse step forward during the Royal Commission. The hashtag Church2 is now making its way around Twitter. The church didn't do enough to protect children and vulnerable people then, so the state has to step in to do what it needs to do now. That is consequence for inaction. In the case of gay conversion therapy, we've watched people like Martin Iles from the Australian Christian Lobby appear to question or even deny that it exists, yet on my shelf I have a manual obtained in a gay conversion therapy course in Australia. Part of the gay conversion therapy ecosystem, as I've come to call it, is the denial of existence of the legitimacy of LGBT plus people and of the programs themselves. This denial needs to stop because the data on sexual orientation change efforts and conversion therapy paints a bleak picture. It doesn't work and it can do deep and dangerous psychological harm. The church didn't do enough to protect these people up until now, so the state has to step in. That is consequence for denial, exclusion, and inaction. As a Christian, it grieves me because Jesus was a social justice warrior and a model for inclusion in his time. Now, in a free society, the right to say offensive and distasteful stuff exists, especially when it's rooted in what I've come to believe is bad theology. I mean, it's preferable to censorship and communism, but it does hurt people, and we need to be aware of this harm, and we need to ask ourselves whether that's okay. Religious freedom and protections for LGBT plus people can exist side by side. I believe it starts with knowing gay conversion therapy isn't just a course, it's an ecosystem. It's seated in doctrine, it's watered from pulpits that tout terms and conditions on the love of God and says that some sins are more vile than others. It grows in internalized homophobia and the doctrines that make shame and fear somehow foundational to salvation, leading LGBT plus people to think they have to change the unchangeable in order for God to love them. We need to define what constitutes a conversion therapy provider, and we need to ban them. Alongside this, we should criminalise the kind of camps that we saw in the movie Boy Erase, which I hope don't happen in Australia, where people were subjected to lock-ins and forced exorcisms as part of their experience. In my opinion, jail is the place for conversion therapy providers of this type. We should protect the rights of pastors to say whatever they want from their pulpits, as long as it's biblical. But that doesn't mean that they're exempt from the consequences of harm done in Jesus' name. It's not like they are now anyway. It's just that victims aren't always aware or empowered. This is where we can do better. I believe church can do a lot of good, and it does. And it has a special place in the community, in society. But we are not free to cause harm to children, young people, or vulnerable people and be exempt from the consequences of our actions. We need to make this pathway for victims much clearer. We can support organisations like churchclarity.org, which makes it a lot easier for LGBT plus people to know upfront which churches are welcoming and affirming. People like me, Christian progressives who believe there's a solid biblical case for the equality of all people, can speak up. We're here. We've just been a bit too quiet. I believe The greatest challenge to the church in Australia right now is not religious freedom. It's how we personally adjust to a loss of privilege. We aren't the dominant ethos anymore. Society is pluralistic and we better get used to it. If it is these values that we're really protecting, these privileges, then we need to take a second look at the greatest example we have of surrendering privilege for the greater good. That example was Jesus. Whether you believe him to be a myth, a legend, or legit, the message is the same. 1/3 of the Trinity, made human, sent to a marginalised nation to start a bloodless revolution of love that transcended law and to die for the redemption of all mankind. I get sick of seeing groups like the Australian Christian Lobby only get loud when it comes to opposing the rights of others. It seems to me that they are standing up for Christian privilege, not Christian values. We can do better. We should. If you missed the story, head on over to my website, kidkennedy.com, to have a read. You really don't want to miss it. Thank you for listening.